Well, welcome again. My name is Catherine Morrow. I'm on the program committee with the First Saturday PDX program series. Our program series has been going strong now for 21 years, very hard to believe. And we cover a wide range of Chinese history, culture, and art-related topics. Today's topic is going to be on Chinese art, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Our programs are always free and open to the public. And for more information about our programs, we invite you to visit our website, firstsaturdaypdx.org. So this morning, we're pleased to welcome our speaker, Dr. Rebecca Bieberly. She's a visiting instructor at Portland State University, teaching a course in Asian art. Her presentation today is entitled The Pictorial Naturalism and Truth, Contextualizing the 11th Century Luhan Sculptures of Lingyan Temple in China. Rebecca Bieberly received her bachelor's degree from Portland State University and her master's and PhD in History of Art from the University of Michigan. She has worked with the University of Michigan Museum of Art and the Detroit Institute of Arts. She's published on early modern print culture in China and is currently teaching at Portland State, as I mentioned, as a visiting instructor. She's working also on a manuscript about the Song-era Luhan sculptures at the Lingyan Temple in the Shandong province of China. So please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Dr. Rebecca Bieberly.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me today. It is a great pleasure to talk to the First Saturday PDX community and to have the opportunity to share my research with you. So I'm very grateful. Thank you very much. My talk today, entitled Pictorial Naturalism and Truth, Contextualizing the 11th Century Luohan Sculptures of Lingyan Temple in China, dives into the dialogues, debates, and critiques surrounding the truth of imagery in China during the Song Dynasty. At the center of this exploration is a set of clay sculptures housed at Lenient Temple, a Chan Buddhist monastery in China's Shandong province. These works, dated between 1060 and 1066, depict supramundane monastic figures known as Luohan, historical mythical enlightened men who were protectors of the Buddhist law. Rendered in a highly naturalistic style, they are anything but supernatural. With individualized faces and gestures, these sculptures depict seemingly ordinary monks in the midst of regular monastic activities, meditating, sewing, teaching, and debating. With each figure and face unique, these sculptures appear as portraits of individual monks. During the very years these sculptures were created, though, the claim of a likeness produced by naturalistic imagery began to be challenged by an educated and art-savvy public. One word frequently deployed in these debates was the multivalent term true, or zhen. This term, I'll suggest, was a vehicle for writers to emphasize those things natural and unique to the individual, such as one's skills and knowledge. Within arts writing and monastic literature of the period, this arises through an emphasis on gesture and movement, on the naturalness of the individual or the depiction of an individual, not naturalism as understood stylistically. Within this discursive context, I'll posit, the style of the Lingyan Temple sculptures, combined with the figure's informal gestures, alluded to the skills of the temple's clerics and demonstrated the temple's engagement with issues important to multiple communities of the educated public. So I'd like to first introduce the Lingyan Temple sculptures and discuss the naturalistic style of the works in relation to the claim of likeness, before moving on to a discussion of the term true and its variable usage during the Song Dynasty. Located in Lingyan Temple's Qianfo, or Thousand Buddha Hall, the sculpted Luohan figures are placed on raised platforms that line all four halls of the space. The figures, which number at 40, and are rendered in nearly life-size proportions, not quite life-size, but close, animate the periphery of the hall's dim interior. Now, the diagram shown here and on the previous slide shows the layout of the hall with the Luohan sculptures along all four walls, and 3 very large Buddha sculptures in the central space. The additional images here show the sculptures that are located at or close to the corners of the hall. Since at least the late 16th century, the figures have been identified as Luohan, an amorphous category of Buddhist personages that were understood as both enlightened divinities with supernatural powers and as earthly monks. Little else was known about the sculptures until the early 1980s. Conservators working in 1981 and 82 revealed that of this set, 27 were produced and installed in the Northern Song period, sometime between about 1060 and 1066. The remaining 13 from the group were produced in the late 16th century. Conservators also discovered that the sculptures had been consecrated when installed and had originally been located at another hall at Lingyan Temple. And these are some of the objects that were found inside of the sculptures, objects which then give evidence to the fact that the sculptures were consecrated. They also found one inscription, and that was the inscription by a craftsperson responsible for one of the sculptures, and you can see that in the lower left here, excuse me, the lower right here. My discussion this morning focuses on the 27 works produced during the Northern Song period. Some of those you see here, not all of them, but some of them. Not only do these sculptures feature a greater emphasis on individualized facial features and more expansive and naturalized gestures in comparison with the later Ming era works, these were also created just as people were beginning to debate the quote-unquote truth of images. With each of the 11th century sculptures, there is a range of detail that claims a likeness to an imagined sitter. As the art historian Norman Bryson has suggested, it is within the depth of an image's provided detail where we, quote, inscribe real existence, end quote. In other words, the rhetoric of likeness is found within those very details. And I think we can see that with figure 25E from the set, who appears as a middle-aged monk gazing off into the distance. Molded across his face are notations of his age, the parallel crests that run along his forehead, the deep laugh lines on either side of his nose and his mouth, and the rounded brow that hangs over his eyelids. These details, though, also suggest specific interior qualities of an imagined person. He's someone who takes pleasure in life, the laugh lines, but who's also given to deep contemplation, the brow line. The lifelike qualities of this figure, so in the naturalistic style of it, becomes even more apparent when viewed alongside an actual person, as seen with this 1921 photograph taken by the German scholar Bernard Melcher. And in front of the sculptures is the abbot of the temple at the time, who unfortunately is not named. Now, the depiction of Luohan as clerics, though, was not unusual during the Song dynasty. Sculptural sources in circulation at the time describe Luohan as having supernatural abilities, so being able to move objects through the air, and as divinities who can appear in the guise of ordinary monks with no supernatural distinctions. Now, in addition to the Lingyan temple sculptures, there are a small number of extant Song era painted and sculpted representations of these figures that also depict them through a naturalistic style as ordinary monks engaged in mundane activities. And these are several of the most well-known of these works. The seated ceramic Luohan along the top is one of a set of 10 thought to have originally come from Yizhou in Hebei province. Often attributed to the Liao or Jin dynasty, there's also been the suggestion that the set was produced in the later Ming period. The painting along the right, which comes from the famous Daitokuji set of 100 hanging hand scrolls, was painted by Lin Tinggui and is dated to 1186. So this was produced about 100 years after the Lingyan temple sculptures were. It features 5 Luohan engaged in the very common and very miserable, at least according to me, task of doing laundry. The last example is of a set of sculpted Luohan found in Qinglian Temple in Shanxi province, a set that's dated by style to the Song dynasty. Of the limited number of extant Song examples, the Lingyan Temple sculpted set is the most complete and intact of any set. It's also one of the earliest artistic works to depict these figures with this combination of characteristics that visually associate the figures with clerics rather than emphasizing their unearthly and divine qualities as Luohan. And in this respect, the Lingyan temple figures find a close visual correlate with portraits of Buddhist clerics. One of the earliest extant monastic portraits, of which unfortunately there are few to survive, is that of the cleric Wuzhen Shifan, who was a member of the Linji branch of the Chan school of Buddhism. His portrait is dated by inscription to 1238 and is housed at Tofukuji in Kyoto. Like the Lingyan temple figures, the face of this cleric is rendered with great attention to detail, down to the individual whiskers on his beard, as you can see from the image. Painted when Wuzhen was still alive, the portrait may reflect his actual visage. Now, beyond a similar emphasis on the figure's facial features, the cleric's robes and ceremonial ring correspond with 4 of the Lingyan figures. And here you can actually see the ring on Wuzhen. Used to hold together a cleric's outer robes, this ring is seen most clearly with Luohan 34E and 8W from the set. And the robes and the ceremonial ring are markers of status that identify Wuzhen Shifan and the Luohan as top-ranked clerics. The naturalism of the faces and these markers of convention are found on most extant monastic, imperial, and civil portraits of the period. There are, however, other genre conventions not found with the Song era Lingyan figures, but which are seen with Wuzhen's portrait, such as his position on a chair that's been draped with a brocade, and his shoes placed in front of him on a stool. In employing select conventions associated with period portraiture, the producers of the Lingyan temple sculptures were alluding to a realness with the figures that is not substantiated with their identification as historio-mythical Luohan. In other words, these sculptures appear to be portraits, but they aren't. Educated and art-savvy Song era viewers would have recognized the portrait conventions used with the figures, as well as the notations of status that are embedded in many of them, and the allusion to the truth of the figures. So what did contemporary viewers think of the naturalistic style of the Lingyan temple figures? Well, unfortunately, we don't have any period writings testifying to viewers' experiences with the sculptures. In fact, there are actually no definitive references to them prior to the 17th century. However, throughout the Song dynasty and across a range of literary genres, from portrait inscriptions written by monks to poems and painting colophons by artists, scholars, and civil officials, writers were challenging, debating, and very much so undercutting the value of pictorial naturalism. It was not a neutral topic. A central concern for many of the writers was the question of the truth, Chen, of naturalistic imagery. And such was the case for the Chan monk Huanglong Huinan, who wrote the following inscription on a portrait of himself that had been requested by a lay person. A strip of white silk and a painted figure. This they call my portrait. It is merely the thief of myself. My true self has no form. My appearance is not revealed. This inscription, as a portrait eulogy or zhenzan, is found within the monk's collected writings, known as his discourse records, or yulu. Popular during the Song period, this genre of monastic literature included a senior cleric's portrait eulogies, his lectures, noted verbal exchanges with students and lay people, and other utterances. Collected together, they were appended to the latter portion of a cleric's biography for inclusion in various hagiographical collections known as the Flame Histories. The Flame Histories, as genealogical charts, traced monastic lineages of different schools of Buddhism through to the founding of the school in China or to the historical Buddha himself in India. Several early clerics associated with Lingyan Temple are included in these histories. Now, key within Huanglong's portrait eulogy is his use of the word true, or zhen. Multifaceted and multifunctional, this word was and is endowed with a range of meanings. Not only can it be glossed as true, authentic, or genuine, it's also the word for portrait. In this inscription, Huanglong employed the term in its semantic capacities as both true and portrait. In juxtaposing these two readings, the writer establishes a binary comparison in which portraits are the opposite of true. The presentation of binaries in Chan literature of the period did not, as the Buddhologist Robert Scharf has argued, indicate either or choices, but instead asserted seemingly opposite ideas as relational or contingent truth claims. What may appear to be contradictory was actually a display of an author's knowledge and dexterity with Chan logic and philosophy. In positioning two meanings of zhen in opposition to one another, Huanglong was demonstrating his acumen with Chan rhetoric. And this was not unusual. Many clerics played with the vacillating meanings of zhen within their portrait inscriptions. This is one of the conventions of this body of literature. In his inscription, Huanglong takes as his reference point the materiality of the painting, the white silk and the painted figure, the latter of which translates literally as red and green, thus most likely noting the pigments that artists used with painting. Through this, Huanglong implies the portrait is a formal composition, as opposed to a sketch, such as are referenced in the hagiographical collections. More than likely, Huanglong was referencing portraits similar to the ones like Wu Zhen Shifang's, in which the markers of status are clearly attenuated. Huanglong's specificity to the material of artistic production also indicates he was writing for an audience familiar with contemporary art. And this isn't surprising. Clerics were highly aware that their inscriptions had a potentially wide-ranging audience. The scholar, Morton Schluter, among other contemporary researchers, has argued that Song Chan literature, including the biographical collections, was intended as much for non-monastic readers as monastic ones. The Flame Histories were not only in wide circulation, which they were, but the high-ranking clerics whose biographies were included within them had social, educational, and institutional networks that included those scholars and civil officials who were on the vanguard of Song Dynasty artistic and literary trends. Huanglong's assumption of an art-savvy readership was not unwarranted. In these ways, his specificity to the painting itself, not to mention that it's the actual object upon which he wrote his verse, forms a dramatic contrast to the amorphous and indescribable interiority that he champions in the second set of sentences, his formless, quote unquote, true self. Within Buddhist writings of the Song, the term Zhen could be used in one additional capacity. It was a synonym for Foxing, Buddha nature. Buddha nature is the idea that all sentient beings exist as enlightened. A practitioner's goal was to recognize or actualize this innate state. In using Zhen, Huang was not just referencing his skills with Chan logic, but also his enlightened state. For accomplished monks, such as those who did have their portrait painted, the concept of actualized Buddha nature was more than just religious doctrine. It had real-life implications. It was directly connected to a cleric's upward mobility within the monastic system toward the goal of an appointment as an abbot of a temple. It was, though, a very long and complex institutional process. A cleric would first have to serve in a variety of lower-ranked administrative offices, giving him experience with the procedures, organization, and administration of temples. He had to have extensive theological training, usually under the direction of an already established abbot or master teacher. He was also required to pass multiple written examinations at different points to demonstrate his knowledge and capabilities. In addition to all of these requirements, a cleric also needed to establish that his Buddha nature was actualized, that he had recognized this enlightened state and was a member of a Dharma lineage. A Dharma lineage is the one-to-one association between a religious teacher and a student, which can then be traced backward through generations of these relationships to the founders of particular schools of Buddhism in China, and then even further back to the historical Buddha himself. These relationships were also referred to as mind-to-mind transmissions. Documentation of a monk's state of enlightenment and position in a particular lineage took several forms, one of which was a government-issued certificate verifying the individual's religious rank. This document was required of any cleric who wanted to be considered for the position of abbot at a public temple. Huanglong's use of Zhen is not simply a reference to doctrine, nor can it be viewed solely through the conventions of Zhen literature. It evokes his achievements leading up to and including his actualized state of enlightenment, his knowledge, skills, and expertise, all of which have been recognized both by the Buddhist institution and the civil government. In this context, Huanglong's use of Zhen as Buddha nature is inherently tied to him. His Zhen is true. In using this term in multiple capacities, Huanglong refutes the claim of likeness generated by the naturalistic style of his portrait by suggesting it cannot reflect those things that are unique to him. Those things important to Huanglong would have been a concern for the Lingyan temple monastic community as well. In 1070, only a few short years after the Luohan sculptures were installed, the temple registered with the government as a Chan public temple. With this registration, the temple was then required to have an abbot that had the skills alluded to by Huanglong and who was certified by the state as enlightened. The sculptures then might be understood as a part of the temple's preparation for this registration and for the clerical desire to become a part of this elite network of institutions. Throughout Zhen literature, clerics like Huanglong are highly critical of pictorial naturalism. But what did those outside of the monastic institution think of it? Well, as is well documented in Chinese art historical research, late 11th century arts writing reveals a sea change in the evaluation of naturalistic styles of representation. Artists and critics began to probe the expressive qualities of the pictorial arts, and with it, the priority placed on naturalism as an artistic goal shifted to a focus on naturalness, as revealed through the artistic process or seen with the final product. This shift was occurring during the very years the Lingyan temple sculptures were produced. The most often cited indication of the rise of an artistic discourse around naturalness is a quote by the famous scholar official, poet, amateur painter, and arts critic, Su Shi, who wrote, "If anyone discusses painting in terms of similitude, his understanding is nearly that of a child. If, when someone composes a poem, it must be a certain poem, he is definitely not a man who knows poetry. There is one basic rule in poetry and painting: natural genius and originality." Now, Su Shi never suggested that artists should abandon representationalism, but he was, time and again in his writings, highly critical of those who placed a high premium on naturalistic styles. A contemporary of Su Shi's, the late 11th century artist Mi Fu, used this notion of what is natural to an individual in his praise of the landscape paintings of the artist Dong Yuan, a painter of the earlier 5 Dynasties period. As a man of character, he is unrivaled. His peaks and ranges appear and disappear, while his clouds and mists are distinct and thick. His paintings make no pretense at artfulness, but are entirely natural and true. Mi Fu employed the term zhen to describe Dong Yuan's landscape paintings, and did so as a correlate to natural, or tian. He wasn't just identifying these two words, though, with the qualities he saw in Dong Yuan's paintings, but also with the artist himself. Dong Yuan's work is true and natural because the artist is authentic to himself. He is a man of character, thus unswayed by outside forces. Like the monk Huang, Dong Yuan's zhen, according to Mi Fu at least, is true because it's demonstrative of what is intrinsic to the artist himself. The early 12th century civil official and arts critic Dong Yo took another tact in equating what is true with what is natural. He understood these through the gestures and mannerisms involved with the artistic process itself. Those in the world who discuss painting talk about similitude. If they say the work is accurate in resembling natural appearances, then, in my view, they speak of worthless paintings, not those that are authentic images. How can one merely match the colors on the painting with those in nature and expect to achieve a genuine image, and then copy outlines and achieve this? When someone has truly achieved mastery in painting, it is merely a matter of loosening one's clothes and squatting on the floor, and thus being unable to bow and hasten to court. You can hear the echo of Su Shi in Dong Yo's ideas. For Dong Yo, similitude or naturalism was the antithesis of true. He describes an artistic process not constrained by protocol or decorum. He juxtaposes the artist and artistic process as natural and true with the artificiality and ceremony of the imperial court. And this is seen through the last line and through the allusion to a story in the 4th century BCE text Zhuangzi, in which a court artist defies convention by loosening his clothes and squatting on the floor to paint. For Dong Yo, a true zhen image is rendered through the naturalness of the process, a process that reflects the artist's skills. In other words, good artists reveal their own truth through unrestrained creativity. For many arts writers, the issue of naturalness was also at stake in the ways individual figures were depicted. The aforementioned Su Shi wrote of the goals of portraiture in similar terms. Portraiture is based on the same principle as physiognomy. The goal is to find the person's nature, and to do it, You must secretly observe his mannerisms when he is together with friends and colleagues. Nowadays, portraitists make their subjects dress up in robes and caps, making them sit and pose, having them concentrate on a single object, causing them to compose their expressions and freeze. How then could his nature ever show through? Su Shi employed the term nature, tian, to indicate what is unique to a sitter. According to him, this cannot be found through the stateliness of formal portraits, as evidenced by his reference to robes and caps, a term used for official portraits in which the sitter would be dressed in the clothes appropriate to his office, such as we saw with Wu Zhenshifan's image. Standing in opposition to the artifice of these official settings, Su Shi links the idea of natural to an individual's idiosyncratic mannerisms. We can surmise that by mannerisms, Su Shi meant a person's gestures, movements, and facial expressions. His critique of portraits comprises a list of the ways the process of sitting for a portrait stifles these very elements of the sitter. One has to sit and pose, concentrate on a single object, and compose their expression and freeze. For Su Shi, gesture and movement were able to reveal a person's nature, what is unique to that individual, just as Dongyou understood the artistic process as based on an artist's individual gestures and movements. Contextualizing the Lingyan temple sculptures within this discourse, the focus of the figures is no longer on the degree of naturalism used to render them as lifelike or their portrait-like qualities. Instead, it shifted to their quotidian activities and seemingly natural gestures. Most of the 27 Northern Song figures from the set are depicted as engaged in common monastic practices. Some meditate, such as the one you see in the center here, 21E. Another one is counting his rosary beads, such as you see on the left with figure 14W. Unfortunately, his rosary has long since disappeared. And another is sewing his monastic robes, 37E, that you see on the right here. All of these activities were common practices and responsibilities of Song-era clerics. 6 figures from the group, though, are more outwardly expressive. With arms raised and hands gesturing, they appear as if in the middle of debate or conversation. 2, number 18W and 27E, that you see here on the left, are pointing with their right hands in a modified Tarka Mudra, which is a teaching mudra or a teaching gesture. Not stately or formal, all of these figures appear as casual clerics, relaxed yet attentive. They resonate with Su Shi's suggestion that one should secretly observe someone's mannerisms when he's with friends and colleagues. The importance of a cleric's gestures and body language can be seen with other works from this period, such as this hanging scroll titled Discussion Between Mazu Dai and the Recluse Pang. Dated to the 13th century, it depicts the founder of the Hongzhou branch of Chan, Mazu Dai, in the midst of conversation with Pang Yun, a layperson highly adept with Buddhist teachings. The master, Mazu, is seated on a rock outdoors with one leg up in a modified Lilasana pose. Similar to the earlier portrait of Wu Zhenshifan, Mazu's shoes are off as a marker of his status. His smile, in combination with his relaxed pose, his left hand is resting on his knee and his right hand is up in this modified teaching mudra, render the cleric as a kindly old teacher, gently schooling his younger listener. Pang Yun's attentiveness to the cleric, much like the monk's shoes, mark the master's status. A visual rhetoric is established with the image. An esteemed and skilled teacher is one who's relaxed and doesn't stand on ceremony. This painting is termed a Chan encounter painting, as it depicts an exchange between a teacher and a student. This designation rises out of another body of literature found in the discourse records, a genre known as encounter dialogues. Within these writings, there is a similar value placed on rhetorical naturalness and informality through an emphasis on gestures and mannerisms unmediated by religious or social protocols. These dialogues often focus on spontaneous and sometimes physical exchanges between teachers and students. Exchanges in which a teacher's gestures and body language were as important, if not more so, than his words. One of the most notable conventions of encounter dialogues is that they are styled as accurate records of a teacher's words, supposedly secretly recorded by his students. Much like Sushir suggested that painters needed to secretly observe their subjects. In a 1080 publication of the record of Linji, the discourse records of the 9th century patriarch of the Linji school of Chan, Linji Yishuan, we find an encounter that occurs just after the master, Linji, has begun a sermon to a gathered monastic community in the Dharma or teaching hall. Now, forgive me, this is a bit of a dramatic exchange, and so I'm going to read it in an equally dramatic voice. My fellow compatriots, within your lump of red flesh, there is a true man with no rank, constantly entering and exiting the openings of your face. Any of you who haven't figured this out yet, look, look. At that time, a monk asked, who is this true man of no rank? Linji got down off of his meditation seat, grabbed the monk and said, speak, speak. The monk tried to say something. Linji let go of him and said, the true man of no rank, what a dried lump of shit. He then returned to his quarters. Within this seemingly impromptu encounter, the master is abrupt, blunt, and physically interactive with the other monk, almost to the point of violence. And this is in great contrast to the codified behavior for clerics as laid out in the only extant monastic manual of the period, the Rules of Purity for Chan monasteries. And this manual in detail establishes a set of institutional protocols for the delivery of lectures and the religious etiquette for interactions between teachers and students. With Linji's exchange, though, he's presented as a teacher less concerned with protocols and decorum than with the urgency of engaging a student in a moment of teaching. Now, as has been suggested by several Buddhist historians, one function of these works was to act as rhetorical models for novice monks. Through an eminent monk's writings and utterances, as found within his discourse records, young monks learned to think and act like the Chan masters they would someday become. Across many of the encounter dialogues, the mark of a skilled master in his role as teacher is his natural gestures, much like the visual rhetoric established with the painting of the master Mazu. Placed within this context, the expressive and expansive gestures of the Lingyan temple figures are not simply signs of their teaching practices, but are markers of their status as esteemed teachers. The gestures place them within a discourse that lauded informality as a notation of a cleric's skill and knowledge. Educated clerics might have understood the sculptures as reflections of themselves and their own teaching abilities. Novice monks might have seen the works as models of behavior for their future selves. For the clerical community as a whole, the gestures, combined with depictions of routine monastic practices, may have rendered, in visual terms, the competency of that local monastic body. The sculptures then also functioned as a vehicle to demonstrate the temple's engagement with the most cutting-edge trends within monastic discourse. For educated viewers familiar with contemporary artistic discourse, the gestures and perceived activities of the Lingyan temple figures would have been understood through issues raised by scholars like Su Shi and Dong You. The quotidian activities and distinctly non-stately gestures evoked considerations on what is natural to the individual, his or her own truth. Visually realized as earthly monks rather than as supernatural Luohan, these figures would have pointed to the temple's clerical community, to the skills and knowledge of those individuals. These sculptures were produced at a moment when those inside and outside of the monastic institution were wrestling with some of the key issues provoked by naturalistic imagery, issues that are provoked with naturalistic imagery produced anywhere in the world. What is revealed time and again with the sculptural set is the ways that it engaged with those key issues. Norman Bryson has observed that, quote, there is a hierarchy of semantic relevance with imagery, that some parts of an image are more discursively charged than other parts, end quote. For some viewers of these sculptures, it was both the naturalistic style and the naturalness of the figures that evoked meaning. These two aspects drew upon the issues most pressing for an educated and diverse public. During this period, the audience for these sculptures would have included those who were writing and reading the text discussed this morning. Lingyan Temple, like most Song Dynasty temples, was open to the public and served a variety of religious and non-religious functions. It was a sightseeing destination. It had lodgings for traveling monks and civil officials, and as well may have had study facilities for students and scholars, which was a common feature for mid to large-sized temple complexes during this period. For those viewers who encountered the Luohan sculptures during religious practice, such as clerics and laity, the allusion to the monastic community's teaching skills, knowledge, and status may have been most compelling. For civil officials, artists, and others who visited the temple for non-religious reasons, encounters with the sculptures may have provoked consideration on the competency and individuality of the temple's monastic community. The temple, through the sculptures, positioned itself at the nexus of monastic and secular dialogues, a positioning that may have served a very real temple function for the temple. It did, as mentioned earlier, register with the government as a Chan public temple only a few years after the installation of the sculptures. This registration inserted the temple's monastic community into a broad network of affiliations that included nationally known top-ranked clerics and civil officials, who were then responsible for the administration of the temple at the local, provincial, and national level. These affiliations raised the temple's public visibility, which was crucial for Song-era institutions, as they relied solely upon the financial support of laity and visitors. Through the sculptures and through style, the temple appealed to its diverse and educated visitor base, the very audiences most likely to have the economic means to help support it. The truth of imagery may have been debated during the Song Dynasty, but the financial solvency of a temple was not. And for Lingyan Temple, the answer to both was art. Thank you very much for listening today.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was great. Thank you for sharing that with us. We are going to move into our Q&A session. Just a reminder for everyone, Catherine's also put it in the chat, but if you have a question, please click on that Q&A little icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type in your question. If you really can't find that, you can also type it in the chat. You can also send it to me on email if, excuse me, if you want another alternative, I can check that as well during our Q&A. So let's get started. Let's see. Got a couple of intro questions. We'll start with those. The first one comes from Huang. Any idea how the Wuzhen scroll ended up in a museum in Japan?
Oh, the Lintinggui, the 5 Luohan's washing, those or laundering. That's from a set that had been taken to Japan at one point. It was produced in China, taken to Japan. And then in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th, early part of the 20th century, several of the scrolls went on tour, including to the United States. And they were, some of them then were bought by various collectors and institutions here in the States. And so that particular painting is actually located at the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C., although, and I believe there's also one at the Boston Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and then many more in Japan as well. So hopefully that answered that question.
Absolutely. I think it did. Thank you. Another question comes from Elsa. How did the sculpture survive the Cultural Revolution?
That is a great question. They were very lucky. That area, where the temple is located, is in the foothills of Mount Tai. And so this is about an hour and a half south of the capital of Shandong, which is Jinan. It just happened to be in an area that was not well trafficked. The northern side of Mount Tai kind of has historically not been the most popular for tourism or travel. It's usually the south side of this mountain. And so this temple just got very lucky. Part of it was closed down for, I think it was 3 years it was closed down and nobody was allowed in, although there were still monks there. And then it was opened back up again. But yeah, miraculously, it was one of the lucky temples during that period of time, a very unhappy time, unfortunately, for China.
Thank you so much for that. Another question comes, let's see, excuse me. On the latter part of your talk, you were mentioning how, the clerics viewed the sculptures and the various kind of meanings and interpretations that they took from those sculptures. Did those meanings and applications come from, like, were there movements throughout time that they had different meanings, or were they all kind of, you took what you needed from them, interpreted it as you needed to?
So I'm going to ask for a little bit of clarification on that question. In terms of understanding how these particular sculptures were understood, or the relationship between, say, the notions of truth and these sculptures, because if it's the former, how the sculptures themselves were understood, we don't have a lot of documentation of that. The primary documentation of the set of sculptures comes from a 1699 gazetteer called the Lingyan Temple Gazetteer, excuse me. That's just a collection of all of the known information about the temple at that particular time, and it includes inscriptions and poems and imperial edicts and other kinds of things. With the sculptures, though, we really don't have any references to them. There are a couple of oblique references to a set of sculptures that's at the temple, but there was also a secondary set of sculptures of Luohan. It's much smaller. So we don't really we don't know how people approached these until we get into the early part of the 20th century, where we do begin to have some more records on them. In terms of how these sculptures related to the term Zhen and truth, of course, I'm going through literature and making some of those connections, because we don't have anybody who told us or tells us today from that period what it was like to see these sculptures and how they might have understood truth in relationship to the naturalism of these figures. So I hope that answered that question. If it didn't, please type back in again, and I'll try to do a better job with that.
I think that was great. But yeah, please, if anyone has a follow-up question to that, feel free to put that in the Q&A box. And I apologize for the pronunciation because I'm terrible at it, but you mentioned the word Zhen and truth. So a question comes from Huang asking if that character word is the genesis of Zen in both meaning and phonetics. So or spelled Z-E-N, excuse me.
Okay, so Zen is in Zen Buddhism.
Yes.
Probably. So Zen is just the Japanese pronunciation of Chan, so Chan Buddhism, so just a school of Buddhism. So with the Japanese side of things, of course, we would say Zen. And here in the States, that's the pronunciation most of us are probably used to with that. Very early, actually, within Chan Buddhism in China, the term Zhen for truth does get used in several different capacities. More so that term, though, I think prior to the Song dynasty, so prior to the 10th century, was used more often than not in Taoist texts. It was used frequently, Zhenran, for immortal. And so you see that used quite a bit more, I think, prior to the Song dynasty in Taoist texts. And then early in the Song, in the 5 dynasties and the early Song period, the Northern Song period, the Hongzhou Chan school, among others, kind of picks up that term and begins to kind of play with it and play with natural gesture and mannerisms and these kinds of things as well. So I hope that clarified a little bit there.
Absolutely. The questions are rolling in now. This is great. Jeffrey asks, could you continue with the status of the temple and its caretakers in recent years?
Sure. Well, the temple has remained a working monastery. So there are clerics who live there. It did, as somebody mentioned, asked about the Cultural Revolution, it survived through that period. It was still in reasonably good shape, I think, moving into the 1980s and the 1990s. In the 1980s, there was this conservation work done with this set of sculptures. And this was at the time, one of the most well-known artworks or groups of artwork from the temple. In the period that followed this, in the latter part of the 1980s and getting into the 1990s, there was a lot of collaborative work between the temple and local and then regional arts and conservation groups. And so there was a lot of work done. And in addition to that, then moving into the early part of the 2000s, Shandong University has gone in on several different periods to do a lot of excavation work at the site. During its heyday, the temple, probably during the Tang dynasty and then also the Song, it was huge, probably, we think. And we have references that there were 200 to 300 monks at the height of the temple status who were living there. And certainly excavations have shown that it was significant. And so a lot of that work was done in the early part of the 2000s. And then in addition to that, there has been a big move between about 2005 and I'd say maybe 2015 or 16, a big move to increase tourism at the site. It is, like I said, a working monastery, but there's been a lot of kind of revamping of the site and the complex to make it more visitor friendly. It's maybe the right way to put that. And again, though, it is still a working temple. So as you are there, the monks are going about their business and having their routines and rituals as well. So it's becoming, I think, more publicly visible in the last 15 or 20 years, which is going to help with the conservation aspects of the temple, I think.
That's great to hear. A associated question comes from Gretchen. You mentioned the excavation and being able to view those sculptures in the temples. Are, in this particular one and other ones, if you might know of, are temples now being refurbished and the figures restored?
For some temples, definitely. I think one of the big issues with restoration, probably across China, is the fact that there are so many places, so many artworks that need restoration, just because it's such a long history. And so there is definitely a move toward doing that. There's also been a fair number of projects that have been international or have utilized organizations and sites in China and here in the States and in Europe to work on those conservation issues, or to use newer technologies to kind of help with some of those issues. The most well-known example, of course, of this is the Mogal Grotto at Huang in Western China, which has seen a lot of restoration work in the last 20 or 30 years. And a lot of it has been partnerships between the Dunhuang Institute in that region, which is in Gansu province, and then the Getty Institute as well. So yeah, I think there is a big move to do as much conservation with temples and with artworks as well, just to keep them in good shape so we have them for the future.
That's great to hear. Thank you so much. The next question comes from Sabina. She asks, I saw the Chinese character for longevity is shown on the robe of one of the figures shown in the last screen. Is longevity considered one of their blessings?
For the Luohan, kind of, yeah. So this category of divinities, we kind of have these separate moments of time in which they are given particular qualities. So they do have supernatural abilities, like being able to move things through the air. They can hear long distances. Their status in terms of longevity really has to do with the fact that they are protectors of the Buddha's law, and the original, I hate to use that word, but kind of the original Luohan stem out of being historical or disciples of the historical Buddha. And so that is one of the qualities that was given to many of them. And then because the Luohan, they operate in kind of this gray area between being earthly and divine. There are some stories about them having exceptionally long lives or coming back even to earth in the guise of somebody else, so a different monk. There's a few stories about that, about clerics who are in essence Luohan, named Luohans from the past as well. So yeah, longevity is kind of sometimes a part of the qualities that they're given, among lots of other things that change historically over time, depending how they're being used within particular communities.
Thank you. We have actually two questions that are very similar, so I'm going to put them together. Sabina asks, I saw two of the figures have dark skin. What race are they? And then Dennis also expands on that, saying it appeared that the features of several sculptures were not very Chinese. Did they represent other ethnicities or monks from other countries?
They definitely did. If it's okay, I'm going to pull us back a few slides and see, actually here is a slide that shows this. So yes, you see that there are two sculptures, two figures here in the lower left and the lower right, darker skin. I should say first and foremost that these were last repainted in the, the later part of the 19th century. So historically, they've been painted a number of times, which means we have to be a little bit cautious with reading skin color with that, because that may have changed over time. But certainly, I think those two in particular probably at least from the conservation information I've seen, probably that color is consistent with how they were painted hundreds of years ago. And it is a reference to them being South Asian and being foreign, not being Chinese, which, again, given that the Luohan originally were historic or disciples of the historical Buddha, they would have been South Asian. And with this category of figures, there is this vacillation between when they are identified as Chinese, Han Chinese, and when they are identified as foreign as well. There's also been some research by some of the conservators who were working on the sculptures in the early part of the 80s, who have argued that most of these figures, at least the ones from the Song dynasty, have facial qualities and characteristics that are similar to those who live in Shandong province. So square faces and kind of larger foreheads. So that's been one argument that's been made for at least some of them. The others, though, yeah, it's a reference to the quote unquote foreignness of Buddhism, and also probably to that notion of lineage, that the temple and its monastic community stemmed all the way back, that they could trace themselves all the way back to the historical Buddha. It's my guess, at least, for that.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to go back to the very origins of these sculptures. One question is, who created the sculptures?
That is a fabulous question. And I wish we had the resource, or I wish we had any documentation of that. So I'm going to take us back a couple of slides, if that's okay again. So we don't know much about their production. Let's see, there we go. We don't know too much about their production. We have no documents of any variety that attest to that. We do have this one inscription that was found in one of the sculptures. The sculptures on the interior, they have wooden armatures, and then there were boxes made of wood that were inserted inside, in which then were these objects and this inscription as well. It tells us the name of one craftsperson. We have another inscription that's actually located on the sculpture that you see on the right here. This is an iron sculpture from the Song dynasty that was commissioned, the inscription tells us, by a group of lay people from some surrounding areas. This was found as the internal armature for one of the Ming dynasty sculptures. And so it was taken out. It was probably produced right around the same time as the clay Song sculptures. So there is, we don't know the names of any craftspeople except for the one. Given how big this set is, 27 sculptures, almost life-size, it had to have been a fairly substantial workshop that produced them. The conservator's report tells us that the wood that's used on the armature is from Shandong and is probably from this region of Shandong. So these sculptures weren't moved, or at least if they were moved, they weren't moved far. They were probably produced in Shandong. For my own research, I have looked to see if I can find any names of workshops of craftspeople who were moving, probably moving from one site to another to produce works. I can't locate one that was working in Shandong. So yeah, we don't know who produced these, but my guess is probably a workshop that was producing things in lots of different areas. So one of the many things that we will unfortunately never know about this sculptural set, I'm afraid. So hopefully that gives you a little information there about the producers of these.
Absolutely. I think that gives us great insight into the history there. Another question also related to more of the origins from Catherine. When these sculptures were created, would they have been on display to only clerics or monks at that temple, or were they accessible to temple visitors?
They would have been accessible. So one of the things that some of the excavation work at the temple complex has revealed, in combination with this conservation work they did in the early 1980s, was that the sculptures were located more than likely at a hall that was directly behind Qianfo Hall. And so this was directly to the north, and excavation has revealed kind of the remnants of that hall. And that hall was more than likely the teaching hall or the Dharma hall. I kind of put that in quotes, or give a caveat to that because I have some kind of different ideas. But nonetheless, it would have been a hall that was open to the public. And given the size, again, of this sculptural set, I think we would be hard pressed to say that it wouldn't have been a point for visitors to come and see these. This is just too large of a set. And the original hall where they were located, they would have been arranged similarly. So on all four walls with central space reserved for other sculptures. So yeah, it would have been open to people. And even though we don't have that documentation, I would imagine that this would be the one hall at the temple complex that people would go and visit because of these sculptures. They're actually that spectacular that, yeah, it would have to be, I think, the focus. So hopefully that gives a little bit of info there.
Absolutely. Moving on a little in history, we have another question that says, were other sculptures for other temples created soon after, also showing the Luhan in activities?
Yeah, so there are a few. Let's see here. Forgive me, it's going to take me a minute to, there we go. So we do have there are 5 or 6 temples during the Song dynasty that have these sets of Luhan. And you can see the one here, the Qinglian temple that I mentioned, and there's also another Baosheng temple and a couple of others. So yeah, during this period, these sets were being created. Most of them smaller than life size or close to life size. We also have a few written documents from the period of people who mention seeing these sets of Luhans in different places, sets that are no longer extant. So it was kind of I hesitate to say a popular activity for temples to commission these works, but certainly it was not unusual. With the Lingyan temple sculptures, the trickiness with them comes down to the number of sculptures that the temple had. It was very common during the Song dynasty to have Luhans that were grouped together either in groups of 16 or 500. So with the Lingyan temple sculptures, it's been theorized that there were originally 2 sets of sculptures of 32, so a total of 32 sculptures, and that when the original temple the original hall they were in collapsed in the Ming dynasty, 5 were destroyed. And so that might tell us a little bit about those numbers, because the other sets of extant sculpted Luhans that we have in various temples are either of 16 or of 18, which was another not necessarily unusual configuration. It was 16 Luhan plus these additional 2. So Lingyan temple may be a little bit different in that. It may have had 2 sets of Luhan, maybe, although I have some different ideas about that, whereas the other temples only had 1 set. So yeah, not unusual for the Song dynasty, at least.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. Our next question, it comes from Elsa. Was this temple and its sculptures venerated during successive dynasties?
I wonder, with dynasties, I'm wondering if you mean kind of by the imperial court, which if that's the case, definitely Lingyan temple was known by the imperial court. We have several name changes for the temple at different points, specifically in the Tang dynasty and the very early part of the Song dynasty, name changes that tell us that the imperial court was acknowledging the temple. We also have inscriptions from stele at the site that tell us of 2 imperial visits to the temple, one in the Tang Dynasty and again one in the early part of the Song Dynasty, in which the emperor and his retinue came through on their way to Mount Tai, which again, this Lingyan is in the foothills of it, and the emperor stayed overnight. And this was a really big deal for the temple. It was really expensive for the temple because they had to house everybody and feed everybody. So definitely the imperial court was aware of the temple. In the post-Song dynasty, the temple did shrink in size and became less well-known, a little bit maybe more lost in the landscape, the national landscape of temples, at least as far as I can tell from the sources that we have, until about the middle part of the Ming Dynasty. And then it does kind of, the public visibility rises quite a bit with the temple at that point. But again, throughout all this period, monks were there, monks were working. There's one smaller town nearby and one that had been there historically as well. People were in the area, people knew about it, people were using the temple and its different spaces. So yeah, in terms of veneration, historically they have been used. We also have evidence on the sculptures themselves that tell us that people have historically touched them. And so we know people were going in and praying to them and giving them offerings and other kinds of things as well. So very long history and very cool history with this temple, I think.
Yes, for sure. Elsa did clarify she did meet the imperial court, so you interpreted that correctly.
Good. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. Another question comes from Moshi. How did the monks learn reading and writing? Who else in the society was taught reading and writing?
During the Song Dynasty? During the Song Dynasty, actually, there was a greater push toward literacy and education due to a lot of changes that were implemented early in the Song Dynasty, which were in essence an attempt to learn from the history of the earlier Tang Dynasty, at least. The government did attempt to establish various schools at the provincial level, the town level, and the provincial level as well. So kind of a first public educational system or structure, at least in China. How well used and maintained that structure was, I don't know, but at least it was, there was that push there initially. So there was a greater degree of educational literacy during the Song. There was also the entrance into government work, into the civil government, was through these in essence, they're like civil service exams today, the civil exams. Those were also opened up in the early part of the Song Dynasty. Previously, in earlier periods, one had to be an aristocrat to sit for those. During the Song Dynasty, it opened up, so you did not have to be an aristocrat. And what that meant was then a lot more people were becoming educated, those who could find the resources to do so at least, and then were sitting for these exams. The government, of course, didn't have jobs enough for everybody who was passing these exams. And so a lot of people then ended up going back to their home areas, home villages and home cities, where they in turn then help to help others become literate as well. So more literacy during this period than one might imagine. And certainly the monks, even the novice monks, would have had to have some degree of education. And of course, if you were a top-ranked cleric, if you were an abbot, even if Lingyan Temple, you definitely would be educated.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from JJ. Does the longevity of Luhan relate to Taoist figures?
In terms of like this, the notion of immortality, there is definitely some amount of connection there. And in great part, I would argue at least, because when Buddhism was introduced into China, it was a lot of the terminology through which it was understood was through Taoist terminology. And so figures this notion of immortality being one of those things. And so as well, when Luohan and the idea of Luohan were introduced in what, the 7th century, slightly earlier than that, they too, some of the language that was used to understand them was taken from Taoism, because the Luohan had these kind of magical qualities about them, and there already was a language in place within Taoism for that. So certainly there is a relationship there. I've read a couple of small things that do seem to, as well, not necessarily insinuate that there is a direct kind of connection between Luohan and Taoist immortal figures, but where certainly authors are gliding between the two, maybe is the way to put it. And so maybe for some authors, there really was more of a connection, and for everyone else, just some connection between the two, if that makes any sense. Hopefully that did.
Certainly. And we have another question that kind of goes back to our excavation and preservation we were talking about earlier. Dennis asks, are the sculptures dusty, or do they have a protective covering?
Oh, I wish they had a protected covering. They're dusty. That's one of the issues with sculptures such as these. So the hall that it's in is open. There's not, at least as of a couple of years ago, there wasn't glass put in some of the windows. And so there is a lot of dust that comes in. And for conservation purposes, they can't necessarily be dusted all the time. I'm not a conservationist, so I don't know all of the details of it, but from what I've read and from what I've been told at the monastery, at least, that dust is left there so that the paint isn't taken away with the dusting. They do get dusted every once in a while, and you can go visit them and suddenly they'll look a lot cleaner, but certainly not often. So it gives them this very old appearance, that if you didn't have the dust, you'd get to see how kind of bright their colors are, and how truly realistic they are in a lot of respects as well.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Sabina. Does the Lingyan temple have a designated cemetery for the Luohan? Did I pronounce that correctly?
For the Luohan?
Oh,
Or,
possibly.
There is what's termed the Stupa forest at the temple complex. And so it's got miniature stupas, which are these memorial structures, these Buddhist memorial structures that stem all the way back to South Asia, in which in the center of these structures are usually the ashes of a deceased person, usually an eminent monk, and occasionally relics as well. So there is what's termed the stupa forest there, where there are lots of these stupa, small and some very large, that commemorate the various monks and abbots who've been at the temple. Some of these do have imagery on them and inscriptions as well. So it's a really useful resource.
Thank you. We are getting very close to the end of our time, and it's just perfect timing because there's this last question that I think is the most fun. And this comes from JJ. Do you have a favorite statue? And if so, why?
That is a great question. I would say, let's see here. I actually have two, if that's okay. So the one on the upper left is a monk who's sewing. He's sewing his robes. I really like him in great part because there were these stories about the ways in which monks were supposed to sew their own robes, patchwork robes, that rags, right, that they would put together in patchwork and sew their own robes as a way of a demonstration of their poverty and their humility and other kinds of things. Of course, that was just kind of the rhetoric. It didn't more than likely most monks didn't do that. But here we have one who actually is, right? He's supposed to be sewing his own robes. Like he is, he's humble, and he's poor, and he's kind of living by those. The other one I like is on the far right, on the upper far right. He looks at first like he has a very kind of unique hand gesture. He's got his hands in a circle in front of his face. I like him because his hand gestures suggest that he was once holding something. And it's long been lost what it is, but I personally like him because there's a change in meaning associated with him. If originally he had, say, a vase or a hand scroll between his hands, viewers in the Song dynasty would have thought one thing. Now we see him in the 21st century, and he just has his hands in front of his face, and it almost looks like he's looking through his hands, having some great moment of enlightenment. And so the meaning has completely changed, even though it's the same sculpture. So I like him for that matter. But they're all very cool. They're all awesome sculptures, I think, at least.
I agree. I think they're all excellent. We have hit the end of our Q&A session. Rebecca, I just wanted to give you an opportunity if you had any last comments or anything you'd like to say before we kind of do our closing. Go ahead.
The only last thing I would say is for anyone who travels to China when things open back up again, and if you are traveling, this temple is in Shandong. It's just about an hour outside of Jinan, the capital. Go and see them. They're spectacular. There's a history here. There's a use of imagery here that speaks to the importance of art and the importance of religion in the pre-modern past that I think resonates with the present day and with our questioning of truth, right? Notions of deep fakes, and is it fake news? Is it real news? What's real? And these are doing kind of the same thing from the 11th century. So if you're in China, if you're in Shandong passing through, go and see them. I guarantee you they're going to spark some thoughts in your head about those notions of truth and how it resonates today. So last thoughts on those sculptures, at least.
Thank you so much for that. That is definitely great things to think about when you're going and seeing these things, these sculptures, and just their historical value as well as their present applications and interpretations that we can take from it. Thank you again so much, Rebecca, for this great talk. I just wanted to point out that we have our audience agrees with me fully. Jeff says, wonderful talk, nicely illustrated and delivered. Thank you. Joji says, thank you so much, brava. And we've got a couple more things coming in the chat. Thank you so much, great presentation. And yeah, so again, thank you so much. This has been great. I do want to point out what's on the slide, which is our next talk, and that's going to be May 7th, titled Celebrated Stories in Sichuan Puppet Theater. Mary Hirsch is going to be talking about the puppet theater and also showing us examples of those puppets as well. It'll be a great talk. And then just again, as a reminder, we will be having our tea house in just a few minutes following this webinar. If you can join us, that'd be awesome. Just to come chat, have some tea, have some lunch if you need to. And we can continue more discussion about these wonderful sculptures, or we can talk about anything that comes to mind. As a reminder also, to get to the tea house, you go back to your confirmation email and it will be the second link when you scroll down. Thank you so much for that illustration. And of course, if you have any difficulties, you can email us on that confirmation email. You can email me. And I think that's it. Again, thank you everyone for attending, and we hope to see you next month. Bye, everyone.